Okay, Olaf, good afternoon and welcome to Berlin.
Yeah.
We've got 5 or 6 minutes with you here. 3 kind of questions that we thought we would ask you. Where do you think the GDS sector as a whole is financially at the moment? And you know where this question is going to lead. I just wondered where because there are rumours of Amadeus looking at IPOs. You officially announced an IPO and later withdrew, and Sabre in the US. At one point said they were considering. I just wondered if you could explain to us what is the thinking behind this drive for an IPO at a sector level, and then if you can speak specifically about Travelport.
I guess in general, I would argue that the GDS as a business is very successful and still continues to drive the majority of the travel bookings. If you then look at the ownership structure that all these GDSs have, they're actually all private equity owned. Private equity in general is, for most private equity companies, a temporary state where you sort of are owned temporarily by a private equity company, and then you either go into another private sale or float back onto stock exchange. So I think there's a logical sequence in that ownership, and then the question becomes, what do you find the right timing, etc. And I guess we at Travelport were trying to float earlier in the year. And in hindsight, probably picked the wrong timing with they're now called tick countries, causing a bit of trouble on the stock market. So if you looked in the few days before we actually had to pull the IPO, all of a sudden the FTSE disappeared by 7.5%. And if you run an IPO, it's just almost impossible to launch that IPO if you don't know where the stock market's going.
Okay, so was it a question of wrong time, wrong place, or wrong place, right time?
I would say unlucky time. I think if you looked beforehand when we thought about launching, and we looked since, it was literally those 2 weeks leading up to our actual date that were particularly bad. And you obviously had all sorts of questions around what the Germans would do as a Greek, etc. And I think it was just during that time when people were very, very unclear about where the whole economy was going. In terms of location, I think I can't comment on the London Stock Exchange, but I think there's no reason to change that.
Okay, and what is the official line at the moment as the state of that decision to maybe launch an IPO? Is it on hold? Is it curtailed? Where are we officially on that?
I think officially we've pulled it, obviously. So officially it's pulled, and we're very much interested in exploring other or existing IPO or other ideas going forward. So it's one of the options.
Right.
And again, it goes back to the general idea that private equity companies is not forever.
So there is a clock is ticking then?
There isn't a clock clicking. It's not like somebody is frantically working behind the scenes and urgently trying to get it refloated. But I think there's a general concept that the business is extremely valuable and the business is extremely profitable, and therefore to restructure some of that, we always want to float.
Okay, and specifically about your relationships with airlines, certainly 2 or 3 years ago, I remember writing, and colleagues that I worked with at the time were saying that the GDSs were no longer the dinosaurs that potentially people saw them as. But then they went into what were on occasions quite protracted discussions with the airlines over their content agreements. But it appears that certainly with the most recent British Airways one, that those agreements have been reached quite quickly. What has happened to that relationship with the airlines to make the discussions that have taken place more recently move quicker?
Yeah, I think in general there was sort of a few years back, you were engaged in the industry already, everyone thought at some point you have 100% direct distribution through the internet. You have no longer any third-party distribution, etc. And I think as a consequence of that, people were very cautious of the costs that actually the distribution would create. But they realized that you can't steer the consumer. If the consumer wants to go through a third party, if the consumer wants to go through a third party channel, then that requires some sort of other cooperation. So the consequence, I actually find that the interaction and the cooperation with the airlines is doing particularly well. I think there is, depending on which part of the world you live in, there's a higher or a smaller internet penetration, but there's always going to be a third-party distribution. There's also a realization that the GDSs have moved on from purely being what I would call like a ticket sale of a seat. They have moved on to actually enable the same business model that these airlines also run on their websites. So we're talking about merchandising and other things where Travelport, for example, is able to do the VA seat sale that recently announced. We'll be the first one to launch this, to actually have this through a GDS as well. So the original thought that for a limited amount of time GDSs were behind, and you have a different business model through a trade and a model through online actually exchange as well. And the cooperation is much more there. So I think it's a realization that it's part of the trade and always going to be there.
Yes, it seems like there's an acceptance on both sides that both models have evolved, and whereas perhaps you were both fighting quite strong corners originally 2 or 3 years ago, that you because of things like ancillaries and stuff like that you have had to kind of re-examine your positions on this.
I think the other thing as well is that we've been able to show that actually that the value of the tickets that we generate for the airlines is different than what they generate themselves online. So consistently we outperform that, and obviously that shows that we have access to a different group. It could be leisure to corporate, but of course it could be also fewer price conscious people, as people who quite appreciate advice and scheduling, etc. So I think that's a big difference as well.
Okay, and finally, Olaf, I'm always very keen to discuss the concept of disruption in travel from a technology perspective. We've had various disruptive models over the years come along and make everybody rethink about how they do business. I mean, what do you see, and where do you see the next kind of disruptive influence coming from?
Disruptive, I think maybe I would slightly change in call it enabling techniques. So if obviously we launched today something called Travelport Opinion, which you've written about a little bit, and we officially launched today in the UK. And what we see is that you have a continuous competition about the various channels, and to actually prove to the consumer the difference between online, offline, advised, direct, etc. And with launching Travelport Opinion today, we've been able to actually copy TripAdvisor onto the agency model, where you have an agency-to-agency product that enables you to exchange point of views.
Is that a disruption to the status quo, though, or is that just evolving your own model in order to reach the needs of your customers?
I say it's evolving and probably improving the abilities of our subscriber, i.e. the agent, to do exactly the same that the consumer can do online.
Yeah.
Other than that, I think there's obviously a question: what do the meta search engines do?
Okay.
But there as well, there's big questions around the online travel agencies and what they do. End of the day, you could argue they definitely changed the landscape, but fundamentally it's still the same sort of relationship between the quality and the price the consumer's looking for.
Yeah.
And even these guys go through GDSs, so it's it all comes back to the good old GDSs.
Thank you.
Thank you.